Hey everyone, welcome to the Tom's Hardware Podcast. For today, October 17th, 2023, we have Dave Jones from Canonical here with us, very special guest.
Good evening.
As always, I'm Tom's Hardware Editor-in-Chief, Abram Pelch, joined by Raspberry Pi expert Ash Hill, left us out today. But we're really excited to talk to you all about how Ubuntu 23 is out now and running on the Raspberry Pi 5, and I have it up and running on my Raspberry Pi 5 right here. Dave, what can you tell for folks who haven't seen you before? What can you tell us about your role at Ubuntu and what you do there?
My role is to be in charge of the Raspberry Pi images on Ubuntu specifically. So I don't deal with any other images, just the Raspberry Pi images, but that covers the server images, the desktop images, and ostensibly core as well, but just the Pi images, as I say. My background is that I worked on various Raspberry Pi libraries. I'm one of the authors on GPIO 0, probably the primary author on Pi Camera, one of the authors on Pi Wheels, various Pi things. That's why I wound up at Canonical doing Pi things.
I've heard of at least one of those libraries.
They get around a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So it was really exciting to see a few days ago that Ubuntu 23 is now launched officially support for the Pi 5. Did you work on that release?
Yes, we have various roadmap items that we try and do on each release, and obviously we had some considerable advance notice that the Pi 5 was coming several months even before we got the advanced hardware, which was before journalists got the hardware as well. So the roadmap item this cycle was Pi 5 support, and we were working on that even before we got the hardware. We had advance notice of what was likely to be on board, and obviously one of the big changes was on access to GPIO. So we were putting in place various things to deal with that even before we had anything to test on.
Wow, that's cool. What kinds of things did you have to change to make it work with Raspberry Pi 5?
There were quite a few things. I mean, I'd love to say lots of the work, but honestly, the kernel team did a huge amount of the work this cycle. The kernel team really pulled it together and pulled in an enormous number of patches from upstream on the kernel side of things, and also on several other related packages like Mesa. So there were a lot of patches to merge there. We obviously have a Raspberry Pi specific kernel in Ubuntu because there are so many patches to deal with. On the GPIO side of things, rather nicely, there wasn't so much to do on Ubuntu. We've been anticipating something like this change for some time on GPIO pins. So back in, I think it was Hirsute originally, and then carrying on through Impish and Jammy, 2204 and slightly before, we were looking at the way that various pieces of hardware are accessed on the Pi, and the GPIO stood out as the one piece where the kernel was being bypassed. Almost anything else, whether you're talking about camera or USB or SPI or other things on the GPIO pins like I2C, all went via kernel drivers, but not GPIO. That was bit banging on memory registers via most of the traditional libraries. And obviously that was not going to withstand the test of time, and lo it has come to pass. In the Pi 5, the access to the GPIO pins changed. So Ubuntu was strangely well positioned there, and we'd already started putting some of that work in place, but obviously Raspbios needed those changes as well. Thankfully that wasn't too difficult. We just managed to upstream the changes that we'd already made. Ben and I did a bit of work on GPIO 0 to incorporate changes there, but yes, touches many different bits of hardware and many different things in the stack, but thankfully there wasn't too much to do on our side of things outside of the kernel team.
So is everything now supported on Ubuntu hardware-wise for Raspberry Pi 5? Do you support the power button? Do you support the multiple cameras, the fan? I noticed on mine the fan is running all the time, and I don't know if there's something that you need to do to set the sensitivity there.
Yeah, this is one of the gaps. You may notice I've got the Pi 5 behind me on the desk there. We got things quite early, and one of the things that we didn't get was the fan board, or for that matter, the official power supply. So I've been using my old Pi 4 power supply on that. So the power button should work. You should have no problems there. The two missing pieces as far as power are concerned are, yes, the fan needs a daemon to go and look after the variable speed control. And secondly, there's a power monitor daemon in Raspbios that I'd like to make more generic. The one in Raspbios is heavily tied into the Wayfire implementation, so we can't directly port that into Ubuntu. We need something that works with GNOME instead. But you may have noticed on Raspbios Bookworm, when you boot up on the Pi 5, you'll see it saying, I've only got a 3 amp supply if you haven't got the full 5 amp supply there, for example.
Right, and you don't have that.
Not yet. No. That is on the roadmap for 2404, the next LTS, and as is the fan work. But we shall see. Waiting delivery of my fan as we speak.
So what is the fan supposed to do now? Is it operating at top speed? Is it operating at kind of medium speed?
Not having one, I don't know. I can only assume it's probably sat there at top speed. Which is more or less what most of the fans will do if they're just given power and not given any PWM control.
So in other words, I could get top performance out of this, because if I don't care about the noise, then it's going to go as fast as it can.
There is that, yes.
Well, I mean, presumably I could use the config text file to overclock it.
Yes, you can certainly play the overclocking game and see if you've won the Silicon Lottery.
Well, what I mean is, what's interesting is, and this is something I haven't gotten a really good answer for from the Pi folks yet, is whether there's a way to manually set the fan tolerances in Raspberry Pi OS. I haven't seen one, and sometimes I'd like it to actually be higher than it is. Or I'd like to try it.
I don't think there's currently a sort of user-friendly interface for that yet. I certainly know with some of the other third-party fans, like the what was the Pyroni fan shim, that had various kernel parameters that you could set in order to say, this is the history, so this is the turn on temperature and so on. I certainly used one of those on my main little Pi 4 for development. I assume there will be similar things in time for the Pi 5 fan, but I don't think there's an interface tied into it yet.
Yeah, because I don't know. I mean, obviously we do a lot in the PC world over here, and here you get in Windows and PC stuff, you get a lot of control over fan curves, when to do it, when not to do it, and I'd like to see, if I just kept it at the max, if I could get a better overclock than if I have it try to do the curve or whatever. So we had, because Les, who's not here this week, got his up to 3 gigahertz, and I tried 3 gigahertz on mine, and it worked. But when if I did something that, I don't know, pushed it a little bit when I was at 3 gigahertz, it might freeze. Mine might freeze. So I was thinking, oh well, if I could. But it didn't seem, even when it was at 3 gigahertz, like it was the noisiest that it had been or could be or whatever. So, it made me wonder, like, could you control the percentage of the fan and then maybe get a better overclock?
Theoretically, I mean, well, whether it gives you a better overclock, I don't know. I call it the Silicon Lottery, because it is the Silicon Lottery. It very much depends whether you've got one of the chips that will maintain that.
I mean, it sounds like 3 is very easily obtainable. By the way, for the folks watching at home, the chip is 2.4 stock. But our understanding from talking to folks at Raspberry Pi is it sounds like 3 is it's very easy to hit 3. When you want to go above 3, that's when you run into issues. However, I should say that we didn't really notice significant improvements in the performance when we went from 2.4 to 3. So I don't know if it's worth, I mean, at least in the workloads that we ran, like gaming, for example, we didn't really see like an improvement in FPS or anything like that. Even turning up even trying to up the graphics to like 11 from 800 to 1100 didn't seem to make the dent. Anyway, Martin asks, so first of all, Martin wants to thank you for Pi Camera. which we all should.
Quite welcome.
And then he asks, as someone who works with OS images, which is your preferred Raspberry Pi and why?
Oh, that is a tough one. But probably my favorite form factor just for playing with is the old 3A Plus. I love it. There's one that sits permanently on my desk behind me. It might just be out of shot, or it's probably a bit too bright under the lamp. And that's the Pi Wheels monitor. So we have a whole rack of an entire rack. We have several Pis that sit in Mythic Beasts Cloud that run Pi Wheels for Ben and I. And there's a monitor that runs on the main Pi that tells us what all the builders are doing and what it's up to. But I don't like monitors that run in a window or take up a window, because I'll go and hide that behind something else when I'm working. I won't necessarily notice it. I'd much rather have something that's just in my peripheral vision all the time, and that's what that Pi sits there doing. So all the little lights on there will indicate it's a Sensat on top of the 3A Plus, so you probably can't see it. But let me unplug that. There we go. So that's the Pi Wheels monitor, and the various lights on there will indicate the status of each of the builders and what they're up to. And if all of that starts turning red, then something's wrong.
That's great.
So it just sits in the periphery, which means I don't have to worry about switching at a window or picking up my mobile for a ping. It's just there, which also means if I'm away from the desk, I don't care. 3 in the morning, I'm in bed, and everything goes wrong. I can wait. Not bothered about getting a ping.
That's great. That's a great use of it.
I've got a question. I want to know, because you guys both have had a chance to play with the Raspberry Pi 5. I'm still in the pre-order list. You know, some of us have to wait. I'm sure plenty of people in the audience know that too. But I wanted to know, out of all the changes that have come out of the Raspberry Pi 5 specs, which hardware change has most impacted the performance for the better, as far as
that's a
goes?
good question. I think one of the major ones has to be the SD card improvement.
Really?
The boot time is ridiculous, and also the Pi 4 was a major step forward in performance, but almost all my machines, other than the big fat PC here, are relatively cheap things. My laptop is a teeny tiny little ASO with a Celeron chip and 4 gig of RAM and 64 gig eMMC. It's cheap, it's rubbish, but it still beat the Pi 4 as a desktop. That thing would still boot faster, it would still launch faster, it was an all-round more capable desktop than the Pi 4. Raspberry gave it a run for its money, but Ubuntu on the Pi 4 was a little tardy on there, and it certainly can keep up with even my pretty rubbish laptop. The Pi 5, no, absolutely wipes the floor with it. It is the first Pi that runs Ubuntu well enough to absolutely rival a PC at being a desktop. We're not quite up to the boot speed of Raspberry, so they're blistering 7 seconds, but it boots in 20 seconds, which is still fast.
Okay, so I'm curious how you're measuring the 7 seconds, because we measured 18 seconds, but that's from turning it on, so that's including the post time. How are you
literally stopwatch, turn on, measure until I get the desktop? Mind you, whether that was testing quite early on, long before the release.
Okay.
The bookworm image has changed a bit since then.
So Les and I, we've used the final beta, I guess, and now the one that came out last Thursday, and we're getting like between 17 and 19 seconds.
Interesting.
Even with an SSD, like with an SSD, it was like 17.8 seconds or something, which is still fantastic because like Raspberry Pi 4, it was like 30 seconds or 40 seconds. So like it's definitely better. And 18 seconds is still great. But but I'm just curious about 7 seconds, because that's pretty good.
I definitely managed a 7-second boot at least. This is going back a couple of months now, but
I wonder if not everything was loading. I mean, it would be interesting. One thing I think we'll attempt to do, and if you have any or anyone in the chat room has any suggestions of things we could do to slim the OS to get it to boot faster, just as an exercise. I'm all for that.
Oddly enough, we've done a bit of work on that. 23.10 has some of that work in there. Just to respond to one of the questions in the chat of would I ever boot off an SD card compared to USB, my main development Pi does boot off SSD, yes. All the rest boot off SD cards. So the little Pi Wheels monitor that boots off SD. I've got another monitor for the house with a bunch of unicorn hat LEDs running on it. That boots off SSD, off SD, not SSD. The Pi that runs the blog runs off an SD card. Almost everything runs off SD cards. As long as you buy decent SD cards, they're fine. You don't have to worry too much about that.
Speaking of decent SD cards, one thing, I don't know if you've done any, does Ubuntu support the higher speeds of like SDR 104?
It certainly should do, yes. And the Pi 5 boots very nicely on Ubuntu. We've got I measured a time, again, this is pre-release, so my times may be wrong, but I measured a time of 20 to 21 seconds on Ubuntu booting, which is pretty nice. That was off a Samsung Evo SD card.
Right.
Haven't really tested SSD boot because, as I say, I'm still running off a 3 amp power supply, so it
Yeah.
doesn't like doing that unless I override the settings.
So I'm curious about, and I think folks would be curious about this, on the on Raspberry Pi OS, if you have a 3 amp power supply, supposedly it gives all the power to the processor and then it cuts the power to the USB. Does Ubuntu do the same?
Yes, I mean that's a hardware aspect. Whether or not that's really not in the control of the kernel, even as my understanding, at least from Gordon. We have a meeting with the Pi Foundation each month where we discuss various things, and yes, the power changes on the Pi 5 did come up. My understanding is basically that if you're on a supply that hasn't negotiated 5 amps, then the USB will be limited to, I think it's 500 milliamps. Enough.
Yeah, I think they said, well, I think it was 600 milliamps and then 1.6 amps if you have the supply. But you could get around that by using a powered hub, right? So if you, so I don't know if any of us has the answer to this. I don't. Can Windows ARM boot on Pi 5 yet?
Not to my knowledge. I would be very surprised if it did, certainly given the unusual nature of the Pi's boot sequence. Windows is pretty much strictly a UEFI thing at this stage. They'd have to have a custom boot sequence to do the Pi.
Steve, Les and I will do a little digging because I don't know if Dave knows this, but there are ways to boot a Raspberry Pi 4 into Windows. It performs horribly. But listen, we're firm believers. If I could change our tagline at Tom's Hardware, I would change it to "Do it because you can, not because you should." So we certainly would love to see if we could get that working. But it's not definitely, even if we got it working, it certainly wouldn't be an environment we'd want to, we'd want to use. But for science, yes, we would absolutely like to do it. My understanding is the previous ones had been some person on the internet had gone and done something to the kernel or put some kind of patch in place that it would make it work with Pi 4. I don't know if those files will allow you to use it on Pi 5, or whoever the smart person is who did this would have to modify for Pi 5 because it's a different ARM architecture.
My memory is probably not very good on this, but if I recall correctly, I may well be wrong about this, but I think it was using an experimental UEFI firmware on the Pi, which I think had been developed for the Pi 3. Again, I may be wrong. And somebody had managed to get that working on the Pi 4. I would be very surprised if that worked on the 5 yet. But who knows?
Right. But but Steve, thank you for the nudge, because we intend to try it. I mean, there's a lot of things we want to try just to see if they work. One of them that I have been trying this week, and I want to give a shout out to Lee PSP, who runs an amazing YouTube channel, because he was able to accomplish this, but I'm trying to follow his directions. And so far I have not, which is running Aether SX, which is a PS2 emulator on your Pi. It has run on the Pi 4 in past, but there's some kind of error that I get with Fuse where in Raspberry Pi OS, where it asks me, it says it needs libfuse2 library, and then I install libfuse2 library and it says segmentation fault after I try to run it. However, I'm going to try shortly doing it under Ubuntu, because my understanding from Lee PSP is that he got it to work nicely on Ubuntu with Fuse. So I am excited. I didn't get to try that because I didn't want to mess up my Ubuntu before this. But because in his video, Lee PSP says that once you install Fuse, it messes up your boot and you have to reinstall the desktop for some reason, which is very odd. I don't know much about Fuse, so I can't really say. But anyway, so that is the story. So how would you describe for folks? Steve says, what's the strangest about the boot sequence?
Right. This isn't so much strangeness specific to the Pi 5. The Pi 5 is really not that different to most other Pis in terms of its boot sequence. Certainly, it's just an evolution of the Pi 4. The only difference there is that the start elf and fix up are no longer needed. It's all on the EEPROM. But as a machine, the Pi 5 is quite a strange one when it comes to the boot. If you look at most other boards, especially modern boards these days, they'll be using some form of UEFI, but that's not the case on the Pi. And moreover, on the Pi, it's not even the CPU doing or in control of most of the boot sequence. It's the GPU. So this is all going back to the very original Pi that was based on a set-top TV chip, where they wanted something on screen as fast as possible. So let's put the GPU in charge of the boot sequence, and then you can have something up really quickly. But for the sake of backwards compatibility, that's carried on throughout the generations, and the Pi 5 is still in that sense. The GPU, or VPU rather, comes up and runs the boot sequence and brings the ARM cores online, handles the loading of the kernel and the init or RD, and then hands over control to the ARM cores saying, here's your kernel, go run that. So it's quite different to most other machines, and therefore you do tend to need something a bit different.
So I just wanted to share with folks who are watching that I have a remote desktop up on my Pi 5 with Ubuntu 23.10, so you can see what it looks like. I haven't done a ton with it yet, but it seems to be running really, really well. One thing I'm curious to ask Dave about, I don't know if this is something that you're up on, is YouTube performance. So YouTube performance on Raspberry Pi OS with this is still not where I would like to see it. What's your experience been?
Yeah, there will be some gaps here. This is another place where there is an existing gap on Mantic at release, hopefully one that will be resolved before the next release, 24.04. The major gap there is that while we managed to get the patches incorporated for the kernel and Mesa on the base system, the patches for Mesa have not made it into Core 22 yet. That's the snap core that is based on Jammy. And that means that because Firefox is shipped as a snap at the moment, it doesn't have access to the Mesa patches for the Pi 5. Now, for the most part, this doesn't matter. For everything that I've tried so far, it's been basically fine. But for one big screaming exception, there's all stuff I've written about on the blog post I did for Mantic, that if you fire up WebGL Aquarium sample, which I'm sure everybody who's played with WebGL knows, you'll see that gets a screaming 40 FPS on Raspberry Pi, and it gets barely about 2 on Ubuntu at the moment. Whereas if you replace the Firefox snap with the Firefox deb from the Mozilla PPA, again, you get a screaming 40 FPS out of it. But because that's a snap, we should be able to update it fairly easily when the Mesa patches make their way back to Core 22. So hopefully that will be fixed before the next release.
Well, my YouTube specifically, though, on both OSs, I found is still it's better than the 4, but it's still not great. I wonder if there's a software way to make it better, because I'm still getting, so I don't know what it is, but if I run the resolution at 1080p and then I try to play a 1080p YouTube video, it's okay. Not great, 4K. But okay. But if I go to 4K resolution and I play the same 1080p video, even though the video is 1080p, I drop 50% or 70, 60 or 3/4 of my frames.
There may well be something you can do about this. Firefox at the moment, and I need to double check this. I'll actually fire up Firefox on my Pi 5 and just double check because I can't remember. One of those things that has gone back and forth so many times with various Mesa drivers. Firefox tries to default to Wayland at the moment, but at the last time I checked, it was still going through X Wayland. So it's going through a layer that sits on top of Wayland, translating X into Wayland. Now, you can have it run in Wayland natively, and that's obviously the plan for the future, but I don't think it's doing that by default yet. Oh, it is on mine. Now, is that the actual snap version of Firefox, or is it not? I can't remember what I've got running on here. Oh, no, that might actually be the snap version. Yes, it is. Okay, so it is running on native Wayland. In that case, no, that won't make any difference.
So what is your, like, what have you experienced, and what do you think the expectation should be out of a Pi 5 playing YouTube videos?
The expectation at the moment should be 1080p should work smooth. There will be a few frame drops still, but nothing that should affect your usage of it. Basically, it should be smooth enough that you wouldn't mind sitting there viewing it. 4K is a bit of a different matter. 4K requires a lot more video RAM, and although there's been an increase in the I/O bandwidth across the board on the Pi, not just SD card, but memory and RAM, I'm not sure that's quite up to shoveling the 4K video through our pipeline, at least. The difference is there's been some interesting convergence between Raspberry Pi and Ubuntu in the last release or so. Raspberry Pi, what was it before? Bookworm? Buster? Bullseye? Bullseye. Had a much more traditional stack of X and I forget what their network manager was back then, but the new one, Bookworm, is converging a lot more on the modern pieces that you find on a desktop. So you'll have things like Pipewire, Wayland as the backing, and network manager for managing all the network connections. And because of their particular stack, they've gone with Wayfire. Our stack is obviously based on Mutter. My understanding is, and I'm not a graphics guy, my idea of a display is 8x8 neopixels, so not that good at graphics. But my understanding is that Mutter's pipeline is rather more complex, and that there's several transforms that frames need to go through before they hit the display. So I would be surprised if we got up to the same performance at 4K as the Wayfire implementation. On the other hand, who knows? There may be patches forthcoming in Mesa, and I would say that there are some due anyway for Firefox to get the Mesa patches in there. So it won't be good yet. It should improve. Whether we reach quite the performance of Raspberry OS, I don't know.
I mean, I think this is still on Raspberry OS in need of some improvement, because if you if I run a 1080p video, but the resolution of the whole screen is 4K, and I run at max screen, I guess it tries to upscale or something, and it starts to drop a lot of frames, even though the source is 1080p. So it's definitely, I'd like to see it, at least be able to play the 1080p videos on a 4K resolution screen. One thing I really have to give props to Ubuntu for, and maybe it's just my ignorance of how to do this in Raspberry OS, is that you make scaling very easy. It's very easy to up the scaling. So if you're at 4K and you don't want to lower the resolution, but you want things to be bigger, you guys have a wonderful thing in there. Whereas I could not figure out how to do that in Raspberry OS, just to turn up the.
I would assume that will come in Raspberry. Wayland made an enormous difference for that. I know exactly what you mean, because my laptop only has a 1080p display, but it is tiny. It's only an 11-inch laptop, and therefore I can't read the text on there at full resolution. And before Wayland came along I forget even when that was. It was pre-Jammy. But before then, trying to do fractional scaling, you could do double scaling, and that was reasonably performant. But the second you tried to do 150%, which gave you a sort of reasonable screen size for the resolution and screen size, the performance was terrible. And then along came Wayland, and suddenly it works beautifully. So that direct path from the graphics stack has made an enormous difference for things like that. And certainly on the Pi as well. And as I say, that's one of the interesting convergences there, that Raspberry is adopting a lot of these technologies that we've been playing with for a while on Ubuntu now.
So one thing I've noticed on PiOS, and I don't know if there's a way to do this on Ubuntu, is it seems that you no longer have control of the graphics memory split. Is that true in Ubuntu as well?
That is true, and that's largely because of the move to KMS. So previously you had the slightly confusingly named FKMS overlay, which is fake KMS,
Right.
and that's where you had full firmware running on the GPU, essentially its own OS, and the Linux kernel talked to it over the mailbox interface and said, do this, do that, and the firmware went and did it and reported back. And in that case, you had the split between the memory of this OS running on the GPU and the memory of Linux running on the ARM cores. Well, that's no longer the case. Now, under KMS, full KMS, not FKMS, the Linux kernel is in control of everything over here. So there's no need for the memory split. The Linux kernel is handling that memory itself. So yeah, the memory split is irrelevant at this point. There is no point allocating any more than I think there is still something running on the ARM cores that looks after clocks and whatnot, but it's so minimal that you can get away with a 16 meg memory split and it makes no odds to what you can do graphically.
Great. So, Ash, you have looked at some of the great Ubuntu projects that people have been doing on their Raspberry Pis. What are some of the ones you've seen lately?
So these are a couple that we've covered before. You can find more details about them at tomshardware.com. But yeah, let me get my screen set up and I'll show you the first one here. This one I thought was pretty cool. It's a dev server, and you can take it with you on the go, and it's running Ubuntu, and you can. I mean, it's got a touch screen, and you can go crazy as far as like what you want to add to this goes, hardware wise. But yeah, I thought this was pretty neat to take with you on the go somewhere. I don't know why you need to manage a dev server on the go, but you can. And the next one that I wanted to share was actually put together by you, Avram. You wrote this guide, so we're going to have to pick your brain about it. It's from a couple of years ago. You used Ubuntu to run this application that works kind of like folding at home. I think it's called Rosetta at Home, and it helped people, well, during the coronavirus, like very early on during that. This was like June of 2020. That's how far back this one goes. But you used Ubuntu as the base for this particular project. And I like this as a good example of how I think it's really beneficial having something like Ubuntu that runs on the Raspberry Pi, because not everything is going to run that great on Raspberry Pi OS. But when you've got something like Ubuntu that's tried and true, it has a huge community. It's been around for, I don't know how long it's been around for. It's been around for a long time. I played with it back in high school, and I'm 30, so.
Yeah, Warty Warthog was, the older guys in the team are going to kill me if I get this wrong. 2006? I may be wrong about that. Maybe.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, it's, especially, obviously, I enjoy using both this and Raspberry Pi, Raspberry OS. They've both been really, really excellent. I think if I was using the Pi primarily as a desktop computer, I would prefer to use Ubuntu for that reason. And, I think a lot of people now, more people now are looking to switch their, Windows is getting more and more annoying. So I think a lot of people are looking to switch their PCs and their kind of desktop life to Linux, and Ubuntu is the leading Linux desktop OS out there. So I think it's kind of neat that you could, run this on your Pi, and then if you wanted to, you could also run it on high-end PC hardware and have a really good experience there. So
that is one of the joys of having the same set of packages available on your PC, on your server, on your desktop. It's all, or in your Pi desktop. It's all exactly the same versions, exactly the same archive that you're accessing. So there's a certain, it makes it easier to move things when you're dealing with the same version of Python, the same version of the libraries, the same Go, the same Rust, etc.
It's like a common environment.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really fantastic.
Yeah, I must put out that dev server. There are good reasons to have that. I'll be at the Ubuntu Summit in Riga in November, which is next to our engineering sprint. And I usually take my Pi 4, which has been my development Pi. I basically do all my work on the Pi. Even if I use the PC as a dumb terminal to it, the Pi does all the packaging and development work. But that means I take that with me as my dev server. and it has some very strange setups to make that work in a hotel environment. We obviously have our local sort of Canonical Wi-Fi for the event, but you usually have hotel Wi-Fi as well for when you're back in your room. And it's so difficult to, when it's headless, to say, no, don't connect to that Wi-Fi network, I want this one, and then to know what IP address it's on. So now it has, I take it along with a little, I forget the name of the hat, but it's got an LCD display so I can see the IP address that it's found. But then just in case it's on the wrong network and my laptop's on another one, because it's acting as a terminal to the Pi, I have a system where I can SSH over Bluetooth.
Well, you're ready to go.
Yeah, it's bizarre, but it works. There was an act of desperation at one sprint when I couldn't find the Pi. So, right, I'm going to solve this. And yeah, we've got SSH over Bluetooth on there, though it is a very hacky thing, but it works for a remote dev server or mobile dev server. Yeah, and yeah, the boot time is so much better on actually Mantic generally. I must give a shout out to Benjamin, one of my colleagues, who's done an enormous amount of work on it at Ramafest, and the kernel team as well, who did ZST compression on all the kernel modules this cycle. So now the boot time should be improved across the board, not just to Pi.
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest performance improvement I have seen on the Pi 5 is also with the I/O. I mean, the CPU performance is a nice improvement, and I think that's great. But what I've seen very practically is the Wi-Fi is faster, which seems surprising because it's the same. It's the same Wi-Fi chip. It's the same Infineon chip. But apparently, and Jeff Geerling saw this too, and I
SDI interface change, or
yes, it has, I think, more direct connect to the SoC, and like if you have a good connection, it is like 2 or 3 times as fast. So it is now. I don't know. I'm going to actually try this on Ubuntu now, but I did have issues in my house, which Jeff says he did not, where being in this office, which is about 20 feet from my router, which is another room, I was actually getting better 5 gigahertz reception on my 4 than on my 5, which is odd because, same Wi-Fi chip, whatever, but I was not getting all the bands, and so my Wi-Fi speeds on 5 gigahertz were actually better on the 4 here. When I moved both Pis, the Pi 4 and the Pi 5, next to my router, the Pi 5, where reception is obviously going to be great, the Pi 5 was much, much faster. It was like 3 times faster. So maybe it's interference in my house. I don't know if like having the electronics from the fan or something.
I was going to say maybe the fan or something was
because my Pi 4 did not have a fan on it. So
could be.
Was it in a case?
The Pi 4, yes. The Pi 5, no.
The one other thing that can make a significant difference there, and it's one of my bugbears that is another gap between us and Raspbios that I still haven't got around to closing yet, is that on Raspbios, when you first start up, it does prompt you for your region, for your Wi-Fi region. And we don't do that on Ubuntu yet because there is no standard interface for doing it. So it's defaulting to the world region on Ubuntu. And on the server, there is now an easy way of doing that via NetPlan. You can add the regulatory domain into the NetPlan config and it will set it. But there's no good way of doing it on the desktop yet, which is annoying to me. But that makes a huge difference in some regions to the Wi-Fi speed, because if you're on the world region, it's limiting the number of channels that it can use, especially on 5 gigahertz. It affects 2.4 less. But on 5 gigahertz, there are significant restrictions on the channels that it can use and the restrictions that apply to those channels, like radar coverage or radar detection and various things. So it sets the Wi-Fi region, which unfortunately Ubuntu desktop has to be done via kernel command line at the moment.
Interesting. That's very interesting to know. Anyway, I want to thank Dave so much, not only for joining us, but for his amazing work on bringing Ubuntu, the latest Ubuntu, to Raspberry Pi, where it looks fantastic. I encourage everybody to install it. It's very easy. All you have to do is go to Raspberry Pi Imager, and it's right there in Raspberry Pi Imager. You choose this if you have a Pi 4 or 5, or I think even a 3, you would want the 64-bit.
Even a 0. Even a 0 will support 64-bit.
Well, you want the 64-bit version, and and just install it. Just create a card. Just create a card, and it works fantastically. Very very easy setup. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening. We'll be back next week on the 24th with another exciting guest and hopefully some more Pi 5 discoveries. Maybe they'll even, who knows, maybe between now and then there'll be some new new products and accessories coming out because the official release date is the 23rd. So hopefully we'll start to see more third-party stuff and whatever. Not that I know of anything. Anyway, thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.